Let's give our attendees just a couple of minutes, seconds maybe, to file in. Great, I think we can get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Audrey Bolus. I'm the Senior Programs and Communications Associate at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, or TIMEP. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our newest virtual panel, Egyptians in Exile, Activism and Organizing Abroad since 2013. Since Egypt's January 25th revolution nearly 11 years ago, but especially since June 2013, Egyptians in exile have played an increasingly central role in mobilization efforts around human rights, free expression, and justice in Egypt. In his original piece, A Homeland Lives Within Us, But We Cannot Live Within It, Egyptian Organizing and Activism from Exile, TIMEP Bassem Sabry fellow Mohamed Mandour raises a number of questions which our panelists will tackle today. Who has left the country? Why did they leave? How have they organized politically, and how have Egyptian authorities responded to the growing presence of Egyptian communities abroad? Before we begin, I want to remind our audience of a few things. As always, today's conversation is being recorded and will be shared widely after the panel. You can follow along and live tweet with us using the hashtag TIMEPevents on Twitter. And we invite our audience to submit questions using Zoom's Q&A function at any time. So without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce today's wonderful moderator, Miray Philips. Miray is a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Minnesota and a visiting scholar at Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Her dissertation explores U.S. foreign policy towards Christians in the Middle East. Miray was born in Egypt, raised in Kuwait, and now lives in the United States between Minnesota and Washington, D.C. Miray, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Audrey. And thanks to Tahrir for organizing, I think, a very timely conversation. So in the aftermath of the revolutions, we've seen an influx of people leave the region. Entrenching authoritarianism, closure of the civic space, and violence are all some of the reasons that have driven people into exile. So Egyptians have moved to Qatar, to the US, Tunis, and Germany, among many other countries, and their political mobilization has gained momentum. And they're increasingly becoming a force to reckon with. So today we'll talk about these new exile communities, the challenges and opportunities they face, responses by the Egyptian government and the international community. And we're joined today by two amazing experts on the subject matter, Mohamed Mandour and Michele Dunne. So to introduce them, Mandour is the TIMEP Bassem Sabry Democracy Fellow, where he's focused on Egyptians in the diaspora, the challenges they face, and the opportunities for organizing in exile. He last served as the Atlas Core Research Fellow at the Project on Middle East Democracy. He also previously worked as a researcher at the Tahrir Institute for Human Rights Studies, the Law and Society Research Unit at the American University in Cairo, and the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights. And Michele Dunne was the executive director of the Franciscan Action Network. And before joining FAN, her career focused on the Middle East and the US foreign policy. From 2006 until 2021, she headed programs focused on peace, human rights, and democracy in the Middle East at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Atlantic Council. And before that, she served for nearly 20 years in the US Department of State, including assignments in Jerusalem and Cairo. She holds a PhD from Georgetown University. So thank you both for being here. So to get started, Egyptians have been migrating for decades, but what is particularly unique about this wave of migration since 2013? And we can start off with Michele.
Thank you, Miray, and thank you to TIMEP for inviting me. I'm really happy to be with you today. This is a really important subject. I think I was invited on the strength of a paper that Ahmed Hamzawi and I wrote in 2019, but I'm so happy to see that Mohamed Mandour and others have gone much further with this work on what's happening with Egyptians in exile. So just briefly on what's going on, there were previous waves of exile in Egypt, and I think Mohamed's paper, as well as our paper in 2019, goes through those briefly. What can we say, though, about the wave of exile since 2011 and even much more since 2013? You know, we cannot really get numbers to pin down, and this is one of the things about exile that's very interesting. It's very amorphous, but what we do know is this is a large wave of exile, probably much larger than the waves of exile that took place in previous periods of contemporary Egyptian history, and perhaps a more diverse wave as well. There may be more groups of people who felt themselves to be under threat, particularly since 2016, who left Egypt, and they've also gone out in a lot of directions. So it's a dispersed wave of exile, and it's diverse in terms of the groups of people. Both of our papers go through a little bit how after the 2011 revolution in Egypt, there were people affiliated with the Mubarak regime who left. And then in the 2011 to 2013 period, there were a good number of Christian Egyptians who left. There are other waves of exiles of Christians as well. And then after 2013, particularly, of course, people affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood or other Islamist movements in many cases left, as well as later on, not much later, but 2014 onwards, we really started to see liberals and human rights activists and civil society activists leaving. And, in preparing for this conversation, Mohamed and I were talking about it, and I don't want to steal your thunder, but Mohamed said something really interesting, which I found to be true, that a lot of Egyptians have left since 2013, just feeling that it wasn't a good situation in the country and that they would seek educational or business or creative opportunities outside the country, and then have actually become exiles and felt that they couldn't go back, either because of the increasingly repressive situation inside Egypt, because of work that they did while they were outside that suddenly now perhaps made it unsafe for them to return. So we're looking at a very large wave of people in exile, and many of them in exile for an extended period, right? We're now getting like close to a decade for a lot of people.
And Mandour, what are the most pressing issues that Egyptians have been mobilizing for from the diaspora? And what does it look like in all of these different countries?
Yeah, I think there are like three factors that informed the forms of activism that Egyptians have adopted in exile, starting by what's happening inside Egypt when you lose the room for accountability and when the regime has put its control over the judiciary. So people look at international law and in democratic countries. Another factor that contributed to the forms of activism that Egyptians have adopted is related to the relationship between the home country, which is Egypt in our case, and the host country. And the third factor is related to the skills and knowledge that Egyptians in exile have. For example, when we look closely to Egyptians in exile, we find some of them they are either academics, journalists, human rights defenders, and activists. This shaped different forms of activism they have adopted. The first one is related to knowledge production. So Egyptians in exile have tried to counter the state narrative about what's going on in Egypt and to provide alternative narrative after the regime shut down academic freedom and shut down several human rights organizations and shut down independent media. So we can see that several academics now in exile are trying to produce knowledge either from universities or from joining think tanks. We are seeing several human rights organizations, Egyptian human rights organizations that have established from the exile, or moved to completely to exile, like Tahrir Institute, for example, or adopted this mode of working, while some of the researchers and lawyers, they are like working inside, and the other team working in advocacy and media and other area of work stay outside Egypt, so to continue work. We have seen also novelists and writers who moved outside of Egypt. We have seen singers who are now like trying to do this from abroad. Ahmed Nagy, for example, produced several novels and books from exile. Now I think many Egyptians are watching on a daily basis to Bilal Fadl's podcast about what's going on in Egypt, and several activists, they launched their own podcasts. So what's happening outside is Egyptians trying to avoid turning Egypt into black hole by providing alternative narratives through different platforms. Another form of activism is related to advocacy. Egyptians in exile try to urge international powers, namely US and EU, to center human rights and democracy in the relationship with Egypt. You can see now that we have Egypt's Human Rights Caucus inside the Congress. We have seen that due to Egyptian activism and advocacy with the current administration and with the Congress, we have seen a withhold of part of the U.S. Military assistance to Egypt, and we have seen increased of the non-wave part of the military assistance year by year. Last year, for example, the administration cut 130 million. Also, we have seen a lot of advocacy with the EU, with the UN. Another form of activism which is not working, we have seen Egyptians engage with their counterparts. For example, in Germany, counterparts coming from other MENA region and coming to exile and establishing organization. We have seen cooperation between Egyptian human rights organization and Tunisian one in Tunisia, and Tunisia became a destination for regional human rights organization and for exile activists from Libya and also from Egypt. We have seen Egyptian building relationship with organizations like MESA, for example, urging them to do more regarding academic freedom in Egypt. We have seen also Egyptians trying to mobilize and do grassroots mobilizations outside. We have seen Egypt Advocacy Day as an event try to mobilize Egyptians in the US to urge their Congress members to take a progressive position regarding the human rights conditions and democracy in Egypt. We have seen also Egyptians leveraging the laws through Mohammed Sultan case, when he filed a case against ex-Prime Minister Hazem Beplawi here in the US. We have seen also Tahrir Institute cooperating with another human rights organization to file a case against Nexus Technology, which is a French surveillance technology company that sold surveillance technologies to the Egyptian regime, and this surveillance technology was used for forced disappearance and for torturing Egyptians. So we have seen a wide range of activism that Egyptians trying to adopt and perform from exile.
Thank you, Mandour. That's really quite a range of very different forms of activism. And I'm wondering if you, what are some of the goals, or what are the concrete asks or goals that these diaspora or exile activists are asking for?
From my interviews, I can categorize the goals into a short-term one. The short-term one is trying to make a breakthrough in the Egypt's human rights conditions, to release political detainees and introduce several amendments to the draconian laws that currently governing Egypt, and pressure the regime to engage in a constructive dialogue and a real dialogue about human rights and democracy. Basically, most of the thoughts are like thinking about getting Egypt back even to Mubarak era, where there is a margin for freedom of expression, when there is a margin for independent media. Yes, no one like think about totally transform Egypt into a democratic country right now, but at least getting this margin of human rights and democracy that Egyptian have enjoyed under Mubarak. The long-term goal is try to make a successful democratic transition to Egypt and try to avoid the previous mistakes and try to coordinate with opposition inside to make this successful democratic transition.
Thank you. And I wanted to remind the audience too that if you had any questions as we're talking, to put them, I think there's a Q&A box, and then we'll take Q&As in the end. And another, I think, important conversation to have is about solidarities between group, or how exiled communities are thinking about who their allies are. So on the one hand, I'm interested in talking about how Egyptians abroad are coordinating with Egyptians inside and what that looks like, but also how has it been with all the different fractions of Egyptian diaspora and how they're coordinating or not coordinating with one another and what that means. And I have more questions, but we'll start there. And either one of you can.
Miray, I'll be happy to answer that question, but actually I'd just like to put something on the table before I answer that question. So one thing I found in my own work, when I did research on Egyptians going into exile, and when I was in contact, with many Egyptian friends in exile, there's something that goes unsaid that I think needs to be said explicitly, which is the enormous toll of human suffering and trauma that Egyptians in exile endure. Egyptians themselves often don't bring it up because I think they are very strong people, they're very resilient, they're proud, they don't want to be pitied, so they don't necessarily talk about it or say it very often. There are very, very painful moments. Mohamed's paper from earlier this year for TIMEP on exiles begins with the death of Sarah Higazi in Canada, which was one of those moments of such pain, such tragedy. I think, when we all saw the terrible toll of trauma. But I want to say that I think it's important for us to have this context that Egyptians who have gone into exile and not willingly, and sometimes even, as I said, going abroad for an educational or other opportunity only to then find themselves in exile, which they didn't necessarily choose. The number of the toll on family relationships. So, not many Egyptians going into exile are separated from their aging parents inside the country. That's tremendously painful. And we know, for example, about the case of our friend Ismail Skandarani, who went back to Egypt specifically to see his dying mother and was put into prison and given a 10-year prison sentence. Is a very tragic case. But so there are many Egyptians who are separated from their parents, unable to take care of them, unable to be at their funerals when they pass away. There are broken marriages, people separated from their children in Egypt. I mean, just terrible, terrible things. And then there is, the pain and toll just of being away from your country. I can't imagine it. If I had to leave the United States and couldn't come back for an extended period of time. So the toll in terms of physical illness, mental illness, substance abuse, and so I wanted to raise that and just the trauma, the emotional trauma, the broken relationships and lack of trust, especially around everything that took place in 2013, is something that afflicts Egyptians in exile very much. It makes it all the more remarkable what they have been able to achieve, really, and what they've been able to do. So it shows you the strength, the resilience, really the brilliance of Egyptians to be able to move forward with their work and to, form new relationships and to continue to be creative and in so many different ways, despite the heavy, heavy human and personal toll of exile. So I think it's something, I just wanted to say it because I think it's something I have observed firsthand, and it's something that, so when you asked Miray about solidarities, about relationships, these things, it has made it much more difficult to have these relationships. And of course, that is, part of the goal of the Egyptian regime is to disrupt these relationships as much as possible. Egyptians outside the country and Egyptians inside the country, as well as between different individual or groups of Egyptians outside the country, right? This is something the Egyptian regime does not want people obviously working together, particularly if they're trying to do things to call the Egyptian regime to account for human rights abuses or to advocate for a reinstitution of freedoms of various kinds. Now, I will just say, I have seen some really, really productive and remarkable relationships that have been brokered, for example, among different members of the human rights community abroad. These were some of these are people who knew each other and worked together inside of Egypt, but some have not, because they maybe fell on different parts of the political spectrum and hadn't really worked together, but some of them have been able to work together in exile. And I'm also astonished at the way many Egyptians in exile, whether they are intellectuals or activists, or have been able to keep up really robust networks inside of the country and be in touch with people there. But we do have to say, I think, that the big political divide, the big polarization inside of Egypt, particularly between Islamists and non-Islamists, replicates itself in exile, and that this has it's continued to be a situation in which Egyptians from, and I don't want to oversimplify it. We know it's not just two groups of Egyptians, but I'm grossly oversimplifying it. We can discuss, there's much more complexity to it, but it's been very difficult. The trust, and the ability to, the willingness to work together, the willingness to be seen as being associated with each other, and the ability to agree on projects and productive forms of action really has not been there, right? And so that's one of the things, that's one of the reasons why I think Mohamed went much further with it in his recent paper. I was so glad to see that, much more sophisticated in terms of what kinds of really effective work are Egyptians doing in exile. In our 2019 paper, Ahmed and I spoke about it primarily in terms of rights activism and media, were two ways in which Egyptians in exile were really active and really effective, much less so in politics, much less so in any kind of political organizing or political advocacy that would have an effect inside the country. Anyway, I'm sure Mohamed has much more to say about this.
I think there are several challenges that's happening right now regarding Egyptian in exile working together. As Michele describes, there is the phenomena of polarization between Islamist and secular moved from Egypt, inside Egypt, to the exile. So when this phenomena moved, made it hard for the Egyptians to work together. Also, the continuous division inside Muslim Brotherhood made it kind of impossible to coordinate with them on any political work. Also, Egyptians are not united under a political project or a same political agenda. For example, there is a division regarding the universality of human rights, while several human rights organizations and liberal movement think about LGBT minorities in Egypt and religious minorities in Egypt. This is an issue you cannot coordinate, for example, with Islamists on this topic. And wherever there was a shock regarding discussion around Sarah Ghazi case, but it was a perfect example about this division inside the Egyptians in exile. While some people were terribly sad about her case, some people were arguing about her relationship with God and others, but it's a sign about this division and how this division even can go deeper to personal relationships. And this is very important in anything about coordination, in any sorts about coordination for political reasons. Also, when the human rights organization, Egyptian human rights organization, moved from Egypt to exile or adopted this hybrid mode about some working from inside the country and some working from outside the country, they also moved with their mode of working, which is a professional organization working, not a membership membership-based organization. This made this organization lack a mass of support outside the country. Till now, no human rights organization or no organization tried to mobilize Egyptians in exile. So we have seen now Egyptian human rights organizations, they're really influential, effective, they're doing a lot of advocacy, but without this mass and popular support from Egyptians in exile. And also we have seen this mass and popular in exile, but they don't have any platform to practice their activism. They don't have any platform to be involved in any kind of activism outside the country. As you may know better than me, a big portion of Egyptians diaspora, they are associated with Islamist or Muslim Brotherhood, and also Copts. And there's a historical tension between Muslim Brotherhood and all the Islamic movements in Egypt and Copts. So we are not expected any form of working together or cooperation. Even there is a tension between Copts organization and the human rights organizations, while Copts organization thinks that the Copts' dilemma in Egypt go beyond any authoritarian regime, and if there is any revolution, they might badly affected what happened after the 2011 about increasing of violence against Copts and other stuff. Human rights organizations think about that the main priority is to counter the authoritarian regime. So there are two different approaches about what's going on in Egypt. I would also close my intervention with what Michele described, which is about the personal suffering in exile. The personal suffering in exile, I can say it on 3 levels. The one related to financial security. When you just arrive in a new country, you need to make money. You might don't have the language of this country that you just arrived in. You might lack the needed skills to find a job. You might still don't have enough network to find this job. So I have seen so many people who were managing directors in human rights organizations in Egypt. They are now working for a different job that has nothing to do with their previous experience, just for making money. So what they are really care right now is that their financial security and their family's financial security. Also acquiring a legal status and getting a work permit, or acquiring or going through the process of asylum, or this old dilemma about getting legal documents to be able to live in the host country is taking a lot of time and effort from Egyptians in exile. All the things related to trauma, because several Egyptians moved to exile with their trauma. Some of them were subjected to torture. Some of them, as Michele described, lost their parents and they weren't able to attend their funeral. This all factors urge Egyptians in exile to deprioritize engaging in any form of activism, to deprioritize even engaging with Egyptian in exile, and just prioritize their financial security, their legal, acquiring a legal status, and try to heal slowly from what they have been subjected to from living outside and all the traumas that they have subjected to through their life in exile. And I will stop here.
Yeah, I appreciate you both for bringing up the conversation about mental health and individual challenges. I think it's impossible to talk about movements or mobilization without really thinking about the individuals and whether they're able to actually do any of this activism. Sarah Ghazi's death certainly, I think, really shook the community everywhere. So in response to all of this activism, even if fragmented, what has been the response of the Egyptian government to growing exile activism?
Shall I start, Miray? I mean, of course, I mean, there has been a direct Egyptian government response, which is to try to control people in exile, as much as possible, right? And both Mohammed's paper and our earlier paper say a little bit about, Egyptian government efforts to keep track of exiles, where they are, what they're doing, and even, to spy on them and to collect intelligence on them and so forth. So clearly, it's been what exiles are doing has been a matter of concern to discredit them inside of Egypt as much as possible, particularly, exiles who became prominent, in the media or for their human rights activities. I mean, that's a very old game. That type of thing has, went on in Egypt for a long time before. But in addition to that, I mean, one of the things I think that's interesting to look at are some of the recent developments in Egypt in terms of the human rights dialogue, the lifting of the state of emergency, and the national dialogue. Now, I mean, my expectations of what's going to come out of any of these are very modest, right? So I'm not saying that I think that the Egyptian government is liberalizing in reaction to what people are doing in exile. But I do think that there's been sort of an indirect effect as Egyptians in exile have lobbied, whether it's the US government, the European Union and Parliament, individual European countries, and some other countries as well. And those governments have turned around and, raised a lot of these rights issues and so forth with the government of Egypt. Now the government of Egypt feels that it has to, let me put it this way, it has to have something to say in reply. It has to have something to say that, well, we are doing this or we are doing that. We have lifted the state of emergency. Of course, there are many, many repressive laws and so forth that are still in place that, but at any rate, we have started a human rights dialogue. We have started a national dialogue. Now, I think it's really interesting to try to understand the complex reasons why the Egyptian government is doing these things, how many of them are domestically rooted in domestic economic problems, or the fact that elections and that Sisi himself will be up for elections again in 2024, et cetera. There may be domestic reasons that are motivating some of what's going on, particularly with the national dialogue. But I do think that some of this, certainly the human rights, it's not a human rights dialogue, the human rights
Strategy.
Strategy, right, exactly. I was looking for what was the word. Thank you, Miray. The human rights strategy put out by the Egyptian government, and now this national, these are partly an indirect effect, I think, of exile advocacy that the Egyptian government feels it has to at least show it is doing something, because that gives not only the Egyptian government, but governments like the US government or what have you, the French or the German government, to have something to say. Oh, they have this strategy, or they're starting this dialogue. Let's see what comes out of this. So I don't know. I'm curious what the two of you think in terms of these efforts and whether they are partially in response or to exile that show the effectiveness of exile activism.
Yeah, Mandour, take it away. What do you think?
Yeah, I think when I look at what the Egyptian regime has adopted in terms of policies regarding exile activism, I look at 4 categories. I think we can like highlight the first one, which is transnational repression, where through like different forms of transnational repression. The most like disgusting one is harassing the families of Egyptians in exile. We have seen when Mohammed Sultan filed the case against Pahlawi, some of his relatives were arrested. And this is a nightmare for anyone in exile. You can pay the price of your own activism and you're consciously doing this, but you don't want like your uncle, your sister, some people that has nothing to do with politics at all paying this price. And this really like urged like so many Egyptians to think twice before engaging in any form of activism, because you know that some people of your family is gonna pay this price. All the issue related to surveillance, starting from hiring spies. We have seen spy in Germany, Egyptian spy in Germany was arrested, and we have seen one here in New York, Egyptian spy was arrested, and he tried to recruit New York police officers to spy on Egyptians and provide information about Egyptians here. This thought about there are like always Egyptian spies trying to look at what Egyptians is doing in exile, forced so many Egyptians to avoid interacting with each other, because you are not sure about who are you interacting to, who was recruited by the Egyptian regime. So many Egyptians avoid interacting with each other for this reason, for being away from surveillance. Also, Egyptian regime adopted all that tools related to digital transnational repression, starting from using spywares to all the hate campaigns online, denying all the services for activists in Egyptian embassies. This like increasing the suffering of having a legal status. Many Egyptians now don't have their passport and they cannot find a job and they cannot find education or anything, because you are just stuck relying on the Interpol for issuing red notices against Egyptian. Increase this pressure around legal status. Egyptian regime cooperated with several authoritarian regime to deport Egyptians back in Egypt. We have seen Egyptians deported from Kuwait, from Malaysia, from Turkey, back to Egypt. This year we have seen a flight taking one Egyptian in exile from Sudan to Turkey landed in Luxor. So we have seen this different forms of Egyptians in exile being harassed. We have seen the Egyptian regime using this his relationship with other countries to silence Egyptians in exile, after Egypt and Turkey trying to get closer to each other again and starting dialogue. Egyptians who are engaging in the media activism from Turkey were asked to stay silent or to leave the country. So we have seen this coordination. Sudan deported a lot of Egyptians back to Egypt who were in exile in Sudan, after Egypt and Sudan getting closer. So this is the whole area of transnational repression. I will look at as a form of like Egyptian regime trying to change the narrative about the human rights conditions and democracy in Egypt, which is Michele mentioned through the national the national human rights strategy and through the national dialogue. I interviewed one of the diplomats who always met with the Egyptian, and they were like asking about the Egyptians as human rights conditions in Egypt. They were always told, we have this strategy and this is for 5 years, so just give us time to implement this strategy, and it needs like 5 years. And this strategy was endorsed by the U.S. government. And the U.S. Egypt strategic dialogue, you will find a section about that this current administration endorses this strategy, same the EU did. The national dialogue will have an impact about the relationship between Egyptians in exile and Egyptians inside Egypt, because it will ruin this relationship and between both of them, because both of them will adopt a different way of activism against the regime. The regime allowed some Egyptians to who were in exile, who were abroad, to participate in this, while they denied or didn't invite another Egyptian. This will increase a divide even between Egyptians in exile about what strategies should Egyptians in exile adopt towards the national dialogue. And as like we discussed before, there is no like a main political project or a main strategy for activism. So this will be increased. Egypt is going to host the COP27 this year, and Egypt before tried to portray itself as a minority rights protector. So basically, Sisi is moving with what's priority for the U.S. Administration when it was Trump, and when it was COP's right as a priority for the U.S. administration. Egypt built the biggest church, and now Egypt is moving to greenwash its human rights abuses through the COP27, which is always Egypt was endorsed by the US and EU for hosting this event. So there's like a several tactics for portraying and sending a different message and different narrative about what's going on in Egypt to counter what Egyptian is doing regarding through knowledge production. So through knowledge production, you are trying to tell the truth, showing what's going on inside the country. And there is another tool. Egyptian regime also hired several lobbying firms, some of them funded by the UAE, and also as some think tanks like provide Egyptians with platform to speak about what's going on in Egypt. Other platforms is providing the Egyptian regime scholars, we'll call them this way, to talk about what's going on in Egypt, and they are funded by the UAE and funded by Saudi Arabia. So there is a battle in DC about what's going on in Egypt from different think tanks. So there are competition over what's going on in Egypt, and I will stop here.
May I make a comment on that last point, Miray, about, so, what I find is, you say, and it's right, that, that there is a sort of, there are really different narratives about Egypt coming out of different think tanks and so forth. And it's not so much that they're arguing over the same point. Like, to be honest with you, I don't really hear very many people out of think tanks saying Egypt has a great human rights situation. Let me tell you about how wonderful it is. It's just a question of emphasis, well, let's just talk about something else. Certain, whether it's, think tanks or media or whatever, let's just talk about the economy, and let's just focus on, let's look at the exciting new projects in Egypt, the new capital or the city, or people will just choose to kind of go somewhere else, just change the subject, because it's really hard to say anything good about either the human rights or the political situation in Egypt. Now, arguably, and I quite agree with what you said, Mohamed, about using these things, to some extent, the human rights strategy as well as the national dialogue, to try to divide people further, so that you have some people saying, well, give it a chance, and other people saying, what? No way, this is just an attempt to distract and divide us. But as I said, it gives people something to say, right? While it's almost impossible to say good things about the human rights situation in Egypt, by coming up with this strategy, I think the regime gave certain people a chance to say, oh, well, look, they're trying. And as you said, let's give it time, a lot of time, so much time that, by the end of it, anyone who, ever worked on Egypt will have moved on to other things, and before they can be held accountable. So, I think there is, there's a lot going on here. And I often used to say this, that if you read, if you followed the articles, if you just look down the articles about Egypt, let's say even in the New York Times, or there would be a lot of articles with, a lot of really negative stories about what's going on in Egypt from a human rights point of view or an economic point of view. Whereas if you followed sort of Bloomberg News, it was one happy story after another about how great things were in the Egyptian economy. I said, this is like, it's like schizophrenia. It's like there are two different Egypts here. It's just different, you've used the word narrative, which is a really important one, different narratives, different stories being told about what's important to say about what's going on in Egypt, and people just taking off in very different directions with that.
And speaking of divisions and controlling the diaspora and dividing the diaspora, I wonder if both of you would comment on the role of the Ministry of Immigration.
Yeah, thank you. I would just be a bit slightly different with what Michele just said regarding think tanks. I think it's not just ignoring human rights conditions and democracy in Egypt. This narrative is well prepared to provide something that's not accurate academically and research-wise. When you look at, I'm sorry for saying the names, but when you look at Yazid Sair's work on Egyptian's economy and how the involvement of Egyptian military in the economy have ruined the Egyptian economy and have reached us to this point when Egyptian government is paying, is selling most of the successful corporates right now in order to pay its foreign debt. This is an important work about the link between the political regime and authoritarianism and the state of economy in Egypt. And when you look at other articles which is ignoring the elephant in the room, the involvement of Egyptian military in the economy, and just saying that Egypt is increasing its export of terms of gas to Europe. And this doesn't make sense when you look at just one small angle about what is going on in Egypt and ignoring the elephant in the room. And when you are saying this think tank who just got a lot of money from UAE, so you can find this direct link about what is going on in terms of picturing Egypt in an inaccurate way. And I think this is, as Egyptians, this is being done on purpose. From what I understand, at least, regarding the Ministry of Migration, the Egyptian regime is trying to use the ministry for several reasons. One related to the development aspect, increasing the involvement of Egyptian diaspora inside the country, allowing them to buy a lot of houses or lands to increase their economic remittances back to Egypt, and also to incorporate them again in the current Egypt's project, and to kind of compensate what Egypt have seen through brain drain. A lot of Egyptians move to exile or move to diaspora because of the lack of academic freedom, etc., etc. And on the other hand, mobilize Egyptians in diaspora for supporting the Egyptian regime, as Egyptian exile try to mobilize diaspora against the regime. This ministry is trying to do so, and through mobilizing these people, also recruiting spies. The recent spy was arrested in New York, was part of one of this group. This group always appeared when Sisi is visiting a foreign country like Germany last month, like when Sisi arrives here in New York. So this ministry has two purposes: development one, and one related to managing and controlling the diaspora outside, while, for example, this ministry is trying to provide a lot of services for Egyptians outside Egyptian diaspora. They are like denying the services for Egyptians in exile. So it's a tool for controlling, a tool also for repression, a tool for building a wide database about Egyptians in exile and what they are doing. This database is gonna be used for like development purposes. They want to know who in which university and what they are doing and how we can incorporate them. And they might also being used for repression and transnational repression. So this is the dilemmas that we have seen right now, because there are like different approaches to deal with Egyptian diaspora, between development approach and authoritarian approach.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of these insights. I wanted to also remind the audience that if you had any questions, to put them in the Q&A. We already have a ton of exciting ones, so the conversation will continue to be insightful. So as we move towards the end of our conversation before the Q&A, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how the international community, whatever that means, can support and protect Egyptians in exile.
Well, I mean, there have been efforts, by certain organizations, sensitivity to, the difficulties of Egyptians in exile, and also efforts to support Egyptians in exile being able to continue their work. Mohamed mentioned, someone, who was in a human rights organization or whatever, people having to take jobs. And this is sadly very common when people migrate from one country or another, not to be able to to continue the work they were doing before, but to have to accept some kind of other work just to bring in a paycheck. I think there, some organizations, some foundations and so forth have been sensitive to that and have tried pretty hard to put into place support for Egyptian organizations that moved into exile to then be able to host people, or indeed, like, for example, the National Endowment for Democracy has a big Scholars in Exile program. It's not just for Egypt, it's for people from all over the country, and has worked with a lot of universities to put into place fellowships and things. The problem with a lot of these programs is that they're short term, right? The idea is, someone might need help for 3 months or a year or whatever. Well, we're in year 10, right, of this wave of exile from Egypt. So, that's something that I think there needs to be a much bigger acknowledgement. And, Egyptians are in exile, I think, are not looking for charity handouts. They're looking for, ways to continue their work, to found branches of organizations, and they're working hard, right? They're not, as I said, they're not looking for handouts. The other thing that I think needs work, and I'll just speak here from the United States, but I think it's gotten to be a problem in Europe as well, is the whole issue of visas and stays and so forth. It's gotten this, it started, during the Trump years, but sadly didn't get a lot better during the Biden years. It's still extremely difficult, for Egyptians to get visas, to claim political asylum if they need it. These procedures are so long. Some of us have argued for, special arrangements for Egyptians due to the level of repression inside the country. So yeah, there are a lot of things. I mean, there is help there for Egyptians in exile, but it could be a lot more than it is.
Yeah, I would also add to this, starting with countering transnational repression, starting with holding Egyptian officials who are behind this transnational oppression. When we have seen the spy was arrested in New York, we should have seen also the officials who recruited them subjected at least to Magnitsky sanctions, because we should see Egyptian officials subjected to Khashoggi ban. We should see this. We should see the current administration in the US apply its policies that was enacted to counter transnational oppression. Because yes, like, to be honest, the country US administration is doing a lot regarding transnational oppression. But when this transnational oppression coming from countries like China, like Iran, but when it comes from a country who's like has a close ally, is a close ally with the US, no, we are seeing a less of work, a less of commitment. We have seen a lot of other issues that is interfering in this relationship. So all the areas that's regarding to transnational oppression, fixing internal democracy in the US is very important, and also in other democratic countries that are Egyptian. And when for example, we can look at Sultan's case, when the State Department gives Pahlavi immunity, this because of this strategic relationship with Egypt. This is because of like security assistance and arms sales and Egypt's and Israeli relationship, and this because of Egypt's strong ally in counter-terrorism and other stuff. And I think this is a problem from inside the US regarding its commitment to its values regarding democracy and human rights. So fixing the internal democracy is an important step for accelerating all the diaspora and exile activism. Also, I have documented cases when like international organizations avoid to give fund or give grants to Egyptian in exile and prefer to fund human organizations inside, or prefer or to shift to more a development approach regarding Egypt. So I think international donors need to rethink about Egypt after 10 years of 2013. Egypt now, will like most of the bright minds are unfortunately outside of the country, and this bright mind still can contribute to Egypt and still political renaissances, and still can contribute to build a successful country. So I think that are like the main issues that I would love the international community to engage with.
Thank you both so much. I'm going to turn to Q&A, and I'll and Michele, the first one's for you. How contingent is U.S. policy to Egypt on whether the president is a Republican or Democrat? And I'd like to add to that too, what is the role of Congress and for activists to lobby Congress as a strategy?
Right, good question. Look, well, Mohamed just said something about the importance of shoring up democracy inside the United States. I couldn't agree more. And that's actually one of the main reasons why I made a shift in my own career toward focusing more on democracy and rights inside the United States climate as well. So in terms of the question about Egypt, I mean, of course, everything in the United States is subject to this partisan divide. One of the things I think that's been a sad legacy of this is there used to be more Republicans in the US Congress who would stand up, who would speak up against human rights abuses in Egypt, right? It used to be, people like senators like Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio and others who took a particular interest in human rights would speak up. That's less likely to happen now because, unfortunately, of the bad feelings and the greater sort of partisan divide in the United States. It's not impossible. So those who lobby the U.S. Congress should definitely, be in touch with Republicans, and there still are a few, in the House and the Senate who are responsive to this and who want to see human rights concerns as part of U.S. foreign policy. It's harder than it used to be. Now, how much does it matter, the president? look, I think it was really interesting with Donald Trump. Obviously, the whole thing about the U.S. having relationships with authoritarian regimes in the Middle East was much more out front, right? President Trump was sort of just unapologetically out front with this. Now, with President Biden, we saw during the campaign, he attacked that. But of course, we all know that since he became president, a lot of the fairly strong things he said about human rights, whether it's Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and so forth, that's been quieted down a lot, in his actual administration. And that's been partly, because of course, there's always changing priorities, right? And with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the change in energy prices and everything, then suddenly it became a priority to have countries like Saudi Arabia and even Egypt, on side which they aren't really regarding Ukraine, to try to get them on the US side and helping out with energy and so forth. So, Mohamed cited earlier that there was, and I don't know if this would have happened when President Trump was in office. There was this withholding last year of $130 million of US military assistance to Egypt, specifically based on human rights concerns. There were conditions, and the Secretary of State reported Egypt has not met the conditions. Now, there are a lot of things related to that are problematic, and not how many of us might have wished it worked out. What I said in the end is, okay, the Biden administration withheld $130 million. That's 10% of Egypt's military assistance. So I guess what we can say is that the Biden administration is 90% in favor of this repressive military government in Egypt and 10% against. And I know it's a very crude way to express it in dollars and cents, but it's somehow accurate, that there are misgivings, I think, and they're more evident in the Biden administration than they were in the Trump administration. But so what it ends up, what have we seen here? It ends up being a partial withholding, and then maybe, partially in response to that, we see, as I said, the Egyptian government making some of these moves to say, well, we're addressing these issues. We have something to say now. Human rights strategy, national dialogue, emergency law. We are doing things. It all isn't adding up to much inside of Egypt, and maybe it won't add up too much inside of Egypt. But, sadly, this is the way things go in foreign policy. So I hope that's, it's a somewhat different picture in terms of US policy toward Egypt with a Democratic president in the White House as opposed to a Republican, but it's not a completely different picture.
Mandour, we have a question on the Brotherhood. So someone asks, as the largest political organization in exile, are there any hopes for the Muslim Brotherhood to build bridges with governments in the West? But also, how do you understand their failure to mobilize effectively from exile since 2013?
I think that the main problem that Muslim Brotherhood in exile is facing right now is the internal division. And this internal division ended with two fronts that are like competing against each other and sending different messages to even their allies, the Turkey government and the Qatari government. And there's a competition between the two fronts on talking and being involved with the conversation with international powers. There's also another problem that Muslim Brotherhood is facing, is that democracy and human rights is not part of his agenda, to be honest. So when they're like saying about there's oppression in Egypt, there's torture in Egypt, but their limited understanding of democracy and human rights is banning them from portraying themselves as democratic forces. Because yes, Muslim Brotherhood was part of a sectarian, at least discourse against Copts. They are still against many of human rights. So they cannot be allies with the human rights groups. They cannot be allied with progressive political parties in different democratic countries, and this is part of their dilemma outside. I can't remember the complete question. What?
As the largest political organization in exile, is there any hope for the Brotherhood to build bridges with governments in the West?
So for now, I don't think so. They don't have anything to offer to this government in the West, and also they don't have anything to provide even to Sisi to engage in any conversation with them and include them in the national dialogue. I think they are in a very, very bad condition that will not help them in the future. And this is my opinion.
Following up on that, someone else asked, what is the level and severity of polarization among Egyptians in the diaspora? What is the polarization going on, and what are the challenges that poses?
Maybe I can start with just a few simple remarks, but I'm sure Mohamed knows much more about this than I do. But to go back to this issue of the lack of trust, I think it exists on several levels. So I was listening to Mohamed talk about this issue of some Egyptians abroad spying for the Egyptian government. And, this leads to, an extreme lack of trust. I mean, I've been in situations where I was, chatting with an Egyptian friend, let's say in a hotel lobby in Egypt, and suddenly the Egyptian friend spots what they believe is an Egyptian hotel clerk, someone at the front desk or someone, and says, oh my goodness, oh no, I don't know who that person is. I've heard all the hotel clerks have been recruited as spies. I can't be seen talking to you. So I mean, it's really like a very, very everyday matter, for Egyptians, this lack of trust. And then there is the other, like the political lack of trust, which is, the sense, among some liberals that the Brotherhood ruined Egypt's chance at a democratic transition, that it was, the Brotherhood made a disaster of it and allowed, ultimately the military to come in and end it, and the other way around on the part of Islamists feeling that, liberals abandoned them and allowed, et cetera. The blame, I'm not going to say who's right and who's wrong. I'm just going to say that I think those bad feelings and the idea that like we can't, it's hard, we can't work together because we can't trust each other. We're not even sure whether we want the same things or not, and whatever. At the same time, I do want to say, I think in some cases, sadly, human rights abuses have brought people together that, having similarly suffered, whether we're talking about imprisonment, torture, victimization of family members, etc., very, very painful experiences that some people in exile have gone through. In some cases, that has allowed people to build bridges across an ideological divide. And I think in some cases, it's brought about some changed thinking on the part of the importance of things like human rights and democracy among some people because of what they suffered. but that's more of like an individual to individual thing. I've seen, relationships there.
Mandour, did you want to answer that too? The extent of polarization in the diaspora.
I think Michelle addressed it, and because we have like so many questions, I would love to move to
Okay.
to another question. Yeah.
So we have a question about Tunis.
Yes. Yeah. I was going to answer.
Okay. Let me read it out loud then.
Okay.
So you mentioned at the beginning that Tunis has been a place where Egyptians in exile could engage on human rights. Could you talk a little bit about how the political events in Tunis have impacted the ability of Egyptians and other human rights activists to operate there?
Okay. Yeah. I think since the recent political developments in Tunisia, Egyptians in exile are rethinking about staying in the country and doing their work. So some of them, they left Tunis right now, and others, they are like thinking about relocating in another country. Qais Said and Sisi relationship is developing in a dangerous matter for Egyptians in exile. So what I believe in that Tunisia is not gonna be a safe place for different forms of activism done by Egyptians or done by other democratic movements towards any other countries, while the repressions there is a bit slow regarding the controlling of the country and the different political dynamics there. But unfortunately, I think this is the fate of Tunisia, that it will not be a safe haven for exile activism, as I believe.
So we have this question in many different forms, but what is the role of the diaspora in improving the situation inside? And especially if we take into account all the fear that people might have in engaging in anything public, what can the diaspora do?
One thing I would like to highlight is what Mohamed spoke about knowledge production. I think it's very important for Egyptians in exile to be able to develop their own abilities. That is a good thing that a lot of people are doing in exile, going to graduate school or writing books, doing research, things like that. So there is this terrible brain drain, and all these, brilliant Egyptians abroad, them developing themselves, with a hope of bringing those capabilities back to the country at some point is something I think that's very positive. And then work on the narrative, because that's something that in Egypt, what really happened between 2011 and 2013? What has happened since 2013? What's going on now? People inside of Egypt just really can't do that work right now. It's pretty much not possible to do normal kind of social science research and that type of thing in Egypt now, or to write accurately about, Egypt's recent history. So I think it's great that people are doing that abroad. It's very important to establish some kind of terrain of truth on which what's Egypt and what happened and what's going on can be discussed. It's important for people to document human rights abuses and other things that may be used in some kind of future truth and reconciliation process. And then, of course, to be conveying that information to the international audience, whether it's an academic audience, it's a policy audience, media audience. I think all of that is really necessary, because none of that is coming out of Egypt itself right now. It can really only be produced by people in exile. And then, of course, the advocacy that we've spoken of. I mean, the advocacy that we've spoken of, I think in many cases has been effective in saving lives, in getting people out of prison or people on hunger strikes and things like that. It hasn't been effective in changing the overall political situation in Egypt, but that's a much bigger task. But I do think, there are many things that Egyptians in exile are doing and can continue to do that do make a difference. They make a difference now, and hopefully will make a bigger difference over the long run.
Someone asked, there's obviously so much talent in exile. There are brilliant economists, entrepreneurs, lawyers, novelists, and artists. What should the Egyptian government be doing to actually benefit from their talents and create space for them to give back to the country that they love?
I mean, this is a very hard question. As the Egyptian government needs to listen to them, to understand that they are critical because they basically love this country, not because they are spies for other foreign government, not because they want to spread chaos inside the country. They have a knowledge, and they have a lot to do to this country. The Egyptian regime tried, for example, to mobilize Egyptians outside to advocate for Egypt's rise in the water issue with the conflict regarding Ethiopia. Imagine if this all bright mind are gathering together and advocate for this. Egypt now is trying to urge foreign different countries to advocate for Egypt to get the loan from IMF. Imagine all these economists, if they are working together with the Egyptian government, what Egypt will get. All this brain drain, we can't see the effect of it. We can't see how this bright minds can contribute to the Egyptian state. I have a case I documented with Egyptian scholar who is living abroad, and he wasn't involved at all with politics. His university back in Egypt sent him invitation about going back to Egypt and provide a lecture about his work. They needed the security approval from the security apparatus in Egypt for him to go back to Egypt to provide a lecture about medicine or engineering or something. I won't mention his specialty. So imagine someone has nothing to do with politics, has to suffer and has to be asked about his personal political position and his security background and stuff. So but this is the effect of having a harsh authoritarian regime, is losing all this bright mind outside of Egypt and not getting their political and development remittances. What Egyptian regime is focusing on is just the transformation of US dollars to Egypt back, the economic remittances. But there's a lot that Egyptian can do to Egypt if they have this platform and if they have the space and if they are safe in Egypt and outside Egypt.
Miray, I'd just like to add a brief comment to that. I agree completely with what you said, Mohamed, and it's even more than that. This is also true of Egyptians inside of Egypt. In other words, that, the country has so many massive challenges, but it has a lot of brilliant people. And yet, this is a long-term problem. It's definitely a problem under Sisi. It was also a problem under Mubarak, not as bad as it is now, but the problem that you have a very small kind of group of people in the elite who are able to give input into decision making. It's a tremendous wasting of human capabilities, and it leads to very narrow approaches to problems. And it's hard to calculate the cost of this. Robert Springborg wrote a book on Egypt a few years ago. And in one of his chapters, he gets into this issue and he actually tries to like give concrete, tangible examples of the costs to the country of the fact that many bright and talented people are not allowed, almost all the bright and talented people are not allowed because they're considered, not politically trusted by the regime, and therefore they're not allowed to, their creativity and innovation and all the things that they could be contributing are, those contributions are not allowed. So it's a problem. It is a problem of people in exile as well as of people who are there in the country.
And this has certainly taken a human toll on these individuals. So someone asked, what can be done to support Egyptians in exile on the psychosocial level, taking into account the high-profile suicide of Sarah Ghazi, but others since then? What should organizations be doing to support them? What should communities be doing to support each other? And what should governments be doing?
I think like Sarah Ghazi's case and two cases after Sarah Ghazi bring an important alarm about the solidarity between Egyptians in exile. There is a lot of solidarity between Egyptians in exile, but this solidarity should transform into institutional manner. So several Egyptians lack a mental health support because it's so expensive to get it here in Western countries. It's difficult to go to get a mental health support with someone who's not speaking the same language, because it's really hard to express yourself in another language and express your emotions. What I'm thinking about is even not only Egyptians in exile, but Egyptian diaspora need to work together on organizations that will help each other address these three challenges related to financial security, legal status, and psychological support in institutional way. You can look at different diasporas. They have their own organization. They have their own work trying to support each other, and that's what Egyptian diaspora is lacking right now, and that's why several human rights activists rely on other organizations or international ones. But I think we need to get together and to think about this issue in institutional manner with fund and with people who are paid to provide this service, and with a lot of connection. This solidarity is being done in individual manner, and this will not help everyone because not every Egyptian has the same network. So we need to do this in institutional manner.
I really appreciate both of you sharing all of these insights. And as we wrap up, I was wondering if you had any final thoughts about what the future holds for Egyptians abroad.
I guess I would say, as I said, we're in year 10 of this particular wave of exile, right? And it doesn't look like it's about to end. So what I do see and expect to continue to see is Egyptians in exile, as I said, developing their own capabilities through education, experience, so forth. Oh, by the way, one thing I wanted to say about the previous question is that I think for people internationally, in other countries who are dealing with Egyptians in exile, we really need to appreciate the depth of trauma. Very often, as I said, Egyptians don't necessarily speak about their personal suffering and trauma. And I think sometimes, then things go wrong in their projects or whatever, and people don't understand. But these are traumatized people who are trying to put their lives back together, and so there needs to be support for that and patience and understanding about that. but I do see a lot of Egyptians moving forward with their lives, achieving things. I don't think they've forgotten about the country, and they haven't, forgotten about going back. They've moved on in the sense of, building a phase of their lives abroad. But I think for many of them, they would want to go back in a different situation, in a different political and rights situation in which they could express themselves freely and contribute freely to the life of the country. And I hope they will continue to do that and continue to do their research, as I said, to really build the narratives and put things on the record, for posterity about what has happened in the country and what is going on, and that there will be an opening someday. I can't tell you when it will be, but there, that is the history in Egypt. There will be another opening, and I hope that people will be willing to give it another try, to learn the lessons of the past, and yet still be willing to, bring their talents and whatever they've learned abroad, bring that back to Egypt to, to build the country that they really want it to be.
I can say that I understand, or I try to understand, how life is very hard in exile, and how Egyptians in exile are suffering on a daily basis. But I just want to highlight, look how amazing we are. Look at what achievements we have done so far. This national human rights strategy is being launched because of our activism. This national dialogue is being launched because of our activism. This part of the military aid that was withheld is because of our activism. The narrative that we managed to spread in each country, in each place. When you read the New York Times talking about the human rights violations in Egypt, this is our success. We managed to build this narrative and to advocate for it. When I go to my university and I see my students and my professors know the situation in Egypt and how bad it is, I understand that we have made a successful case. When I see people in New York going to protest to support Alaa Abdel Fattah, when I see people in Germany go to protest to support Alaa Abdel Fattah, same in Lebanon. When I see this campaign by Alaa's family touring all over the world for Alaa's release, I understand that we have made a lot. We have made a lot so far, and we should really be proud of ourselves. When I see several Egyptians who are doing their masters or PhD right now, and they are acquiring knowledge to transform this knowledge to be a way of activism, I really should be proud. As Michele described, there will be the time that we are going to see the combination of this effect coming together in reshaping Egypt's future. I think the future of Egypt will be determined by Egyptians inside Egypt and Egyptians outside Egypt, and this why I think the future of ours, and I'm not saying this just to be optimistic or just to say nice words. I'm seeing it. I am seeing it coming. As Michele described, I don't know how, but I'm seeing all these efforts around the world, and all this knowledge and experience we are getting. We have never discussed the military assistance, serious military assistance to Egypt before. We didn't know anything about this. It became a tool for us. We didn't know so much when we were back in Egypt in 2011 about geopolitics. We now understand, or we are trying to understand this situation. This matters about rethinking again about getting Egypt back to democratic transition. We have a large history of experience that we are going to rely on to avoid all the previous mistakes that we have engaged on before.
Thank you, Mandour, for this powerful ending. And it's not only about optimism, but it's true that there's been a lot that the diaspora has done, and it's shown for it. It really is a force to reckon with. And I really appreciate this conversation, both Mandour and Michele, for being here and spending your morning with us. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I want to thank Mohamed and Michele for such an in-depth and extremely timely conversation. Thank you, Miray, for moderating expertly this entire discussion. I guess I want to remind our audience as we're closing out that today's conversation is at the heart of TIMEP's work and mission, and we invite you to continue to follow TIMEP's work on human rights, justice, and accountability, free expression in and outside of Egypt, as well as the work of each of our excellent panelists that you've heard speak today. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us and contributing so much to the discussion. These panels are never the same without your engagement. I'd like to invite all of you to follow TIMEP and our panelists on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn to stay engaged with our work. You can reach out for any media requests by email at press@timep.org, and you'll find this recording on our website and YouTube channel a bit later today. Finally, thank you to the TIMEP team who made this event possible, and have a wonderful day, everyone.